and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, a new kind of Europe. EU leaders meet in Brussels as Britain attempts to renegotiate its relationship with the Union. And farewell to print. The UK's independent newspaper goes digital only as traditional media continues its struggle to remain relevant. We begin today's show with a crucial moment in Britain's relationship with Europe. Leaders of 28 EU countries are gathering now in Brussels for negotiations ahead of a British referendum on EU membership. It should be clear sometime tomorrow whether or not a deal is possible. It's crunch time, really, for Cameron, as he hopes to bring home significant concessions and convince the public that staying in the EU is Britain's best interests.
Make or break for Britain's future in the EU. The Conservatives' election manifesto promised a referendum on membership by the end of 2017. They won at the polls, so now it's time to put their money where their mouth is.
We are a proud and independent nation with proud, independent, democratic institutions that has served us well over the centuries.
Cameron has set out 4 key ways he wants to change the UK's relationship with the EU. First up is European integration. This would allow a British opt-out of the ever closer union stipulation laid out in the EU treaties, and limit the march towards political integration. Next is business competitiveness, extending the single market and cutting down on excessive regulation. Benefits restrictions would see reduced access to migrants. And finally, Eurozone operation, which involves an explicit recognition that the euro is not the only currency in the European Union. But on Thursday, EU President Donald Tusk warned there was no guarantee of a deal. Meanwhile, back in the UK, opinion is divided.
I think we should be out of the Union.
I'm for in.
I think it'd be nice if they can make laws without the European Union interfering.
There's no convincing case for leaving, so it's too big a risk to take, too big a gamble.
Membership of the European Union has been a controversial issue in the United Kingdom since the country joined the then European Economic Community back in 1973. Over the past 40 years, Britain has always stood apart from the EU to some extent. If Britain does vote to leave the EU, it could negotiate an amicable divorce, but retain strong trading links with EU nations to allow British firms to sell goods and services to EU countries without being hit by excessive tariffs and other restrictions. But if Britain went for a completely clean break with the EU, its exports would be subject to tariffs and would still have to meet EU production standards, harming the competitiveness of British business. Some have warned the end result could be a trade war between Britain and the EU, which could cripple Britain's export industries. So, would Britain be better in or out? It depends which way you look at it and what you believe is important.
Britain inside the EU or likely to be out? That answer possibly can be provided after we talk to the 3rd panelist with us today. With me in the studio in Beijing, we have Professor Wang Yiwei, who is the Director of Center for EU Studies at the Renmin University here in China. Welcome, Professor Wang. Meanwhile, joining us from London, we have Professor Ian Begg, who is the Research Fellow at the European Institute of London School of Economics. He's also an Associate Fellow at the Chatham House and Senior Fellow on the UK in Changing Europe initiative. Meanwhile, in Brussels, we are joined by Mr. Paul Yvan, who is the Senior Policy Analyst from the European Policy Center. Welcome to all of you, gentlemen. First of all, may I go to Professor Begg for your views as to what do you think likely to be the result? Britain staying in the EU or out?
I think the most probable scenario at the moment is that Britain stays in very narrowly, but it's very delicate, and if we look at the opinion polls, you see them jumping around. Some say that Britain will vote to leave, some say Britain will vote to stay, but what's most critical is the large number of unknowns, those voters who say they have yet to make up their minds. And one thing they're going to look at is what Cameron is able to achieve in what he's negotiating today.
All right. There are several issues, in fact, Mr. Yvan, when it comes to what Britain wants from the EU. It wants different policies on the single currency. It wants policy changes regarding the migrants. It wants a very different set of economic trade policy favorable to the UK, and also it wants a very different relaxing policy regarding the Schengen countries, particularly toward the UK. So what do you think, Mr. Yuan, whether these four conditions can be met?
Well, we can discuss more about the details of the four conditions. I would say that most of them and most of the other countries, the member states, will try clearly to accommodate the UK concerns. I mean, we had seen from declarations for the last weeks and days. So I think that a compromise would be able to be reached, even though there are sensibilities regarding several of these demands, especially the limitation of in-work benefits for other European citizens working in the UK, or the issue of the ever closer union. At the same time, even if Mr. Cameron will manage to bring a lot from what he proposed back to the UK, it would remain to be seen about how credible this message of his would be for the British public.
How credible do you think, Mr. Begg, Mr. Cameron could be?
Well, we have already seen that.
Mr. Begg.
Well, I think that David Cameron does face a difficulty, which is that many of his opponents, particularly inside his own party, are saying to him, what you're renegotiating is trivial. It's not the big issues that really concern the British electorate. For example, they think that Brussels interferes far too much in our country. They're very worried about the scale of migrants. And here it's important to distinguish between the refugee problem that Europe faces, which is people from outside the EU, and the pressure inside the EU, which is people from countries like Poland, now Greece, Italy, wanting to come to work in the UK and putting pressure on local public services. That's where the biggest opposition lies at the moment to the EU inside the UK. And Cameron is only going to make a difference at the very small margins to that particular problem.
It is not a secret, Mr. Yuan, that Britain has had the tradition of debating about whether to remain in the EU or out. It started even at the very beginning, Margaret Thatcher days, and it continued yet at different stages, different topics, different sentiment. And now nationalism really high inside Europe. What do you make of the possibility of countries' compromise, which is likely to be the breaking point?
I think there's a very clear interest throughout the EU to keep the UK inside the Union. That's very clear and has been repeatedly stated by the leaders of all the other 27 countries. I mean, there are very strong reasons for that, economic reasons, political reasons, even geopolitical reasons, to have a strong UK inside a stronger EU. So the interest is very clear, and even among the British decision makers, when they have a very rational look at the picture, at the benefits and the costs of EU membership, it's very clear that the UK gets more benefits from this relationship compared to what it contributes to the EU budget.
Right.
So what is needed, I think, in the next months in the UK is really a rational debate based on correct information and less on emotion about facts, about figures, and about really where the British interests lie on this.
Britain, of course, is only one of those countries inside the EU that's having second thought, shall we say, about remaining inside that body, even though it probably is the strongest one with the different opinions. Professor Wang, is this going to be the start of renegotiations among countries inside the EU about their relations with the EU and the future directions of the EU?
Well, definitely it's a bad example. Encourage more states to negotiate, bargain with the European Union. But no any other country compared to Great Britain has such a comprehensive and large power to bargain. Maybe in some cases, like a migration issue, like Eurozone and other issues, we can bargain. Like Greece now is talking about the border control The Polish also complain about the migration issues. And it's not good signal sent to European Union. Many people think about the European Union is not the solution, and even the reason of some problems. So it's not more Europeanization can solve this problem, maybe less.
Interesting. Professor Begg, what do you think is exactly the role of Britain right now inside the EU, particularly given the fact that some of your conservative politicians even argue that Britain is closer to the United States than to France, and Germany is playing an ever bigger role inside the EU. Where is the UK? So what do you think is the role of the UK right now, Britain now inside the EU?
Well, the UK plays a lot of subtle roles inside the European Union. For example, the direction in which it's been changing on things like giving greater weight to markets has been pushed by the UK now for nearly 20 years. The UK has also been instrumental in changing the orientation towards the rest of the world of the EU. Countries like France are more inclined to look inwards. The UK is one like Germany, like Sweden and the Netherlands, which says, no, we want to be part of the global community. We want to trade with China. We want to push a transatlantic trade deal. They're great supporters of these sorts of things. And it's also worth remembering that the UK is the second biggest military power within the European Union after France. And that military power is part of the package that comes. Germany pays for it. Britain offers the hard power. France has the idealistic visions of what the European Union should do. Britain provides a lot of the pragmatic things. So it's like any good cook with a recipe. You need all kinds of ingredients for the Union to function.
Right. How big a recipe is it, the European Union? And how good really is an ingredient called Britain inside the big soup of the EU, Mr. Ivan? What exactly is its role?
Well, I would add, especially for the reasons that Professor Begg mentioned, I think the UK is wanted also, especially for those positions, and not only by countries in Northern Europe, but actually by a lot of countries also in Central and Eastern Europe. Those very practical and pro-business views of the Brits are very much valued by countries in this region. Now, it is true that by enlarging, by several waves of enlargement, the EU has grown in size. This has clearly made also reaching decisions, common decisions, more complicated. But we see that when it's really in times of crisis, that the EU does manage to overcome this crisis. And though now the Union is confronted with the multitude of crises, being terrorism,
right.
Being the migrant crisis, the political issue of the UK's place in the Union, the EU also advanced when it had to deal with similar crises in the past.
Well, it's very natural for
so I would remain optimistic.
Okay, it's very natural for Mr. Ivan to express some optimism, but Professor Wang, how exactly should we comment about a mechanism? If this mechanism will be able to endure crisis and even prosper after that, probably it's a wonderful mechanism. Otherwise, it could not endure crisis. That would be a very weak mechanism. Is this a critical point to look at the EU as a mechanism, whether it's going to be long-standing or not? And also, when it's getting looser, as Britain is already renegotiating with the EU anyway, and probably other countries would do similar things in one way or the other. So would that mean a looser EU a better way to go? Or actually, it's worse than before?
I don't think European Union can suffer the exit of Great Britain, and Britain also.
No, everybody agrees.
European Union is very complex. It's a multi-layer governance structure. So there are many crises in refugees and debt crisis, Ukraine and terrorist attacks. It's different in different areas. So now I think UK is just negotiating this membership to push, I think, to push the European Union for reform. And this reform is not just for the continental interests, for the German-led, maybe more balanced for the future. That kind of negotiation, I think, maybe can help European Union more solid. That's the
Mr. Begg, Professor Begg, is it really the beginning of another stage of the European Union to better its system, or this is the beginning of the collapse of the original European Union idea?
Well, the great American writer Mark Twain said, "Reports of my demise have been greatly exaggerated," when there were reports in the press that he had died. And I think that applies very much to the European Union, which is very resilient in ways which outsiders don't often understand. Now, let me give you one very simple example.
All right.
About 2 years ago, all kinds of people were saying Greece cannot survive inside the euro. Greece will have to be kicked out of the euro. Look today, Greece is still inside the euro, and there's still strong support inside Greece, in spite of all the austerity policies they've endured. So I think that it's important to recognise the robustness of the political commitment in all countries towards the European Union, of which maybe the UK is the only exception. Now, one possibility for the future is that we have what's called in the trade differentiated integration. Some countries agree to go much deeper, which is what the entire Eurozone is doing. They're creating a banking union, they're establishing new rescue funds, and some countries agree to have a less complete integration, but all remain part of maybe a two-circle European Union. That could be the future in 10 years' time. But for now, I think it's an integral one system with different speeds towards getting to the different places.
We see different roles being played by different countries within the EU. UK, for example, now in renegotiation with the EU, but also Germany earlier playing quite a pivotal role, trying to making the union ever more intense and closer among the members. Mr. Yuan, are we going to see two very different ideologies coexist inside the EU, or there's likely to be a general big battleground not long from now?
No, I mean, like Professor Begg was saying, the issue of differentiating integration of multi-speed Europe has been with us for a number of years. I mean, it's not only the UK that has opt-outs, some other member states, Denmark also has an opt-out. Some countries are members in the Schengen area, other EU members are not part of the Schengen area. So there are all these very different layers and different ways to be integrated inside the Union. Obviously, there is a strong internal core around the single market and a number of other issues. Germany is clearly trying to hold the Union together, is trying to push to reach decisions at the level of the 28, at the level of the whole Union in order to maintain its integrity. Because indeed we do see fragmentation in different crises. We do see some countries looking more at national solutions rather than at European ones. Right. So there are very challenging times, no doubt about it. But like I stated earlier, I maintain my optimisms that these European leaders will realize that only by working together they can tackle some of these challenges.
Professor Wang, first of all, I want to ask you, as an outsider, what do you believe is the strength of the EU that is still attractive to the others?
Well, I think European Union is the result of the Second World War, even many wars before. But now the European countries not just felt the threat of the external attack, but now inside, like migrations and the terrorist attack. This is maybe a European Union difficult to handle. And most importantly, I think European Union globalized, very differentiated, not just the competitive advantage. Like UK is more financial service, and it's not rely on the manufacture and the trade. So that's different with the Germany and other countries. But my question
more is, what is still attractive to you from an outside regarding the EU?
European Union maybe is a solution, but it's not the only solution. So nationalists also rising, populists, and many others. That's, I think, is fundamentally challenges for European countries, not just like the Cold
So
War.
do you think eventually with a union, European Eurozone of 19 countries and a trade bloc of 28 countries, is it really possible to run that huge body forward?
Maybe still larger, more countries will join. So more crisis means more integration. That's the experience of European integration.
We hope that will be the case. More crisis, more integration, and more experiments, possibly more better results. Let's hope that will be the case. Well, we're going to expect some results at least on the day of tomorrow, I guess, as early as tomorrow. Wang Yiwei, Ian Begg, Paul Yuvan, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Stay with us here on World Inside. We got our final segment coming right up. Farewell to print. The UK's independent newspaper goes digital only as traditional media continues its struggle to remain relevant. Welcome back. You're watching World Inside on CCTV News. The UK's independent newspaper is going out of print, making the move to become an entirely digital publication. The newspaper is expected to go to the presses only last time on March the 26th. It's all part of a larger struggle in the media marketplace as traditional publications fight to remain relevant in an increasingly digital world.
30 years ago, it was seen as revolutionary. But now The Independent is fighting to keep up with the times. With its print business struggling, it's become the first major British newspaper to end its print edition and go entirely digital.
The idea that The Independent is shutting or closing is complete and utter nonsense. The Independent is focusing on its digital future, which is the future for all of us. Fact is, the business model for paid-for news Monday to Friday is kaput.
Readership has been falling steadily in recent years in the face of increasing competition from digital news sources. Today, The Independent's print run churns out a mere 60,000 copies a day, a far cry from its peak of 400,000. But the company is now putting its bets on digital, offering a subscription mobile app and opening new bureaus around the world. For some, it's a natural evolution, but others worry about whether online outlets can offer the same quality as their printed cousins.
I think for a lot of people under 30 who are now reading online, this announcement about the Independent stopping printing is in a way beside the point, because for them the Independent already only exists online. They're not interested in the print version. But of course, there are older readers, such as myself, who will mourn the passing of the print edition. The danger, though, of online newspapers is that they tend to be more dumbed down than their print counterparts, and that's one other worry I would have about the Independent's future online. I'd like it to maintain its high editorial standards.
Like The Independent, Newsweek also discontinued its print edition in 2012 after 80 years. But it later bucked the trend by relaunching its print edition in 2014. The whole market is in a state of flux, and it remains to be seen what shape the future of media will really look like.
For more on The Independent going digital and the general idea of where the print media will go, we're joined by, in London, Mr. Terry Kirby, who is the director of the School of Journalism at Goldsmiths University of London. He's also a founding member of the staff, former night editor and chief reporter at The Independent. Welcome, sir. Meanwhile, in Miami from the United States, we're joined by Mr. Eric Newton, Innovation Chief and Professor of Practice at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism in Arizona State University. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. Well, I guess it's pretty much a mixed feeling for you, Mr. Kirby, working for The Independent and now seeing it's likely to go digital only. What does it mean to you?
Well, I find it's very sad in one sense. It's very poignant in another. It's sad because it is the end of an era of a particular newspaper that I was very closely associated with. It occupied a large portion of my life, my professional life. It's sad also because it will mean the loss of a number of jobs of journalists who've been working for the print edition. The exact figures are not clear, but it could be around 100. It's very poignant because the great tradition of print newspapers, which grew up in Victorian times in the 19th century around the world, is dying out. And newspapers were a unique way of reflecting the times we have lived in, and so that is also very poignant. But on the other hand, I do not think the news is entirely bad.
Well, we could be a little bit reminiscent at this point because this is also the year 30 years after The Independent made its appearance to the public. But at the same time, isn't that a general trend that print newspapers likely to be digital only now, particularly inside the United States? Professor Newton.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
Well, yes. In the United States, I think you could say generally that print is, it's like the sun. It's rising in the east and setting in the west. And in all the Western industrialized countries, we're seeing the print circulation falling and digital viewership and users growing. And so it's really just a matter of time before nearly all of the traditional print outlets are digital.
Well, it is one thing whether you would be able to hold a physical newspaper in your hand. It could be sentimental. But the most important thing is whether it's on paper or it appears on various screens. The most important thing is whether the subscribers will be big enough, that body, to support the operation of a real journalism organization. That is the most important question to be asked. Professor Newton, what about the situation inside the U.S.? Is it possible, depending on subscribers online?
Well, no. I mean, there will be some digital publications that will be fine with just subscribers. There will be others that will be successful because they are part of our public broadcasting system. There are others that will be successful because they are partnerships with television, hybrid models. Some of the news from journalism schools will become more important. Some of the news will be from nonprofit news providers who use events and memberships and other vehicles for revenues. And of course, there still is advertising, and some of the publications will be able to make it with advertising.
Mr. Kirby, do you think The Independent will be able to survive in the future digital only, depending on subscribers' input and also advertisers?
Well, let me say first of all that I agree with the professor there that there are going to be a variety of models in the future, different ways of doing journalism online, and I don't think there is a case of one size fits all. We are in an extended period of transition from the age of print to the age of digital. There are obviously ways in which some publications can survive online. Whether The Independent will be able to do that in the same way, I think, is really the big question. It is going to be entirely dependent upon how the newspaper that is presented in the online version. Will it be entirely focused on clickbait, or will it be as much as possible an online version of the current print editions? I think it will have to rely upon a large number of named writers that have given the paper the credibility and gravitas that has kept a loyal readership. And it needs to retain the same values of being questioning, of being largely politically independent, of not being beholden to any political party. And I think these are reasons why people love The Independent and why people will hopefully be brought onto the online version.
Professor Newton, while listening to Mr. Kirby, you could tell this is a gentleman, together with his colleagues, still very much willing to do quote-unquote real journalism. Inside your country, for example, real journalism, really respected traditional journalism, has not survived very well among many of the publications, shall we say. For example, with the Washington Post, yes, it's an exception because Mr. Bezel volunteered to support this specific newspaper for its credibility. New York Times, another exceptional example, because the family business wants to maintain its credibility. But many others did not survive at these two. So when you listen to what Mr. Kirby has pledged earlier, does it ring a bell to you? Or actually you can have a big smile on your face and pat on his shoulder and say, brother, way to go?
Yeah. It's not an easy answer. In the short run, there are many problems with the digital transition. In the United States, we have a news system that was built up town by town, city by city, with the daily newspaper becoming a very important part of every community's life. Those daily newspapers all across the United States have suffered many, many thousands of job losses. So we do have a local news crisis in the United States. Not really with the Washington Post or the New York Times or many of the national brands, but the local news, that's where it was only the newspaper who would watch over the government officials and the powerful in town and provide a voice to people who had no voice.
Mr. Kirby, is that likely to happen also in the UK? Will the similar situation happen?
Well, I think this... Yes, I think this is exactly what's happening in the UK. There is a deficit. Local newspapers, in the same way as in America, have basically crumbled. They're just not present in communities in the same way. I began my career more than 35 years ago on a local newspaper, which was a fairly vibrant part of the local community. And it is really important about holding local power structures to account, about representing the views of ordinary people, about being part of communities. And that need is still there. But unfortunately, in many parts of the United Kingdom, it really isn't happening at all.
Well,
and equally, that applies at national level, that newspapers need to retain the same values of scrutiny of the authorities and the public figures and the politicians in business, which is what we are here to do. And if websites become focused entirely on celebrities and clickbait, which is the danger, then it is a very, very sad day for democracy.
Professor Newton, do you think that value system, what we call the credibility of a news organization, which is traditionally believed as the most important thing ever about our trade, is that still there? Will that still be there? Two things. One is financial challenges. Second is citizen journalism becoming ever more important.
Well, all these things are happening at the same time. At the same time that there's more sensational news, there is also, on a global scale, more investigative news available to the average person. 20 years ago, you could not look at the World Wide Web and see the best investigative journalism from around the world. That wasn't possible. It's now possible. But on a local level, it's difficult. I'm optimistic in the long run that people will seek out the news that helps them run their lives and their governments, and they will need it, and they will need even more meaning in the sea of information and data that we are swimming in. The long term is I'm optimistic. It's the short-term economics where companies that were built to deliver the news a certain way are finding that the news is atomizing. All the different pieces of the newspaper are going to some other place in the digital ecosystem. And so we're going to suffer, maybe for an entire generation, a very rough transition.
But here is an interesting scenario, as many of the insiders have been talking about. Will, in the future, Mr. Kirby, journalism becoming something of nonprofit? What I mean is, news media organization is not likely to make profits, but rather being supported by those who subscribe to the ideologies that the newspaper wants to promote, and also by the citizens who would like to have a so-called force power to scrutinize the current system. Is that scenario likely to happen?
No, I don't see how it can happen. I don't think you can have sort of crowd-funded journalism on a mass scale, if that's really what you're referring to. Well, I'd like to see the model. I'd like to see it done. Newspapers or news gathering organizations, whether it's in print or online, require a good deal of professional organization and maintenance. It may well be that such a model might emerge in the future. I mean, I wouldn't rule it out, but traditionally, to do the kind of authoritative, responsible journalism that we need, you need to pay for authoritative, responsible journalists to do their jobs, and that doesn't always come cheap.
Professor Newton, though, what are we going to see in the near future? Because let's face some facts. Yes, the citizens want the media to scrutinize the government, make sure it is going to run based on its promises. But at the same time, many of the readers of whether online or offline newspapers or media do not necessarily want to pay for what they read, what they watch. This is about the internet culture in a way. Are we going to have another huge crisis in which this kind of practice will be scrutinized before the whole society realize we have to figure out a new way for the short-term possibility?
I think that's exactly right. Things are going to get worse before they get better.
It's always right to say that, isn't it?
They'll get.
I think it's true.
Or you might say that they're going to get worse and better at the same time, but we'll only pay attention to the worst part. But I do, there are new nonprofit models emerging in the United States. Some of them involve of nonprofits that are supported by donors and by members. Some of them involve education-based journalism, like the Cronkite News at Arizona State. Some of them are very small, sort of mom and pop, hyper-local news outlets. And these are all growing and gaining. It's likely they will never be exactly what came before. And so the question is not how do we save what came before, but how do we reinvent journalism for the coming century for young people who are used to getting news, not just digitally, but on their mobile devices, and for the future generations that will get it even more differently in ways we can barely imagine.
Of course, journalism is a traditional trade, but at the same time, Mr. Kirby, it is shouldering the responsibility of enlightening the public while at the same time serving the public. How much do you expect that can be done online together with your colleague? Very briefly, we only have 40 seconds left.
Well, I think it can be done online. There is no reason why the same values can't be translated online. The Guardian, for instance, has an extremely successful website which embodies all the virtues of the Guardian newspaper. Nobody's under any doubt of what that is. I think the model is more difficult to implement at a local level, although we are trying it with our student journalists. We serve a local community with journalism students, filling in a gap between the provision of local news in London.
Professor Newton, 10 seconds for you, unfortunately.
The future eventually will work because people need a fair, accurate, contextual search for the truth to make modern societies possible.
All right.
In the end, it'll be okay.
Eric Newton from the United States, Terry Kirby from the UK. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Keep our fingers crossed. Thanks.
Thank you.
And finally, here's my take on what's happening in China right now. Apple Pay is now available in China. That is exciting news for Thursday, according to some. So what is it about? Well, that means beginning from 5 a.m. on Thursday, the mobile payment service provided by Apple together with China UnionPay has officially become available in this country. Apple Pay employs near-field communication technology, or NFC. It allows people to tap their iPhones on a point of sale and pay for their purchase. To use Apple Pay, an iPhone 6 or iPhone 6s users can wave their phone over a vendor's contactless reader with a finger on the phone's Touch ID. Users can also use Apple Pay by accessing Apple Wallet with a double click of the phone's home button while the phone is locked, or by accessing Apple Wallet on their phones. But will it be a success? That's the question. Technically, NFC is very different from the system used in China, which is quick response or QR codes. Alibaba and Tencent, two of the country's tech giants, have been using that for some time, and the latter two already dominate the Chinese market, particularly Alipay, which controls about 70% of China's mobile payment market. In Q3 of 2015 alone, Tenpay took about 20%. Meanwhile, NFC has greater hardware requirements than software-based solutions such as QR codes. It is strictly limited to iPhone 6 or iPhone 6s. And globally speaking, by 2018, NFC payment is only estimated to take up 6% of total mobile transactions worldwide, while the rest will use software-based services like QR code. So whether Apple Pay will become a success or not in China is still unknown, but at least for today, it is a talk of the town as one of the hottest trending topics on China's social media. And that is all the time for today. If you'd like to see more of our world program, you can visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You'll be able to find us. You can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.